The first thing I saw when I turned onto my street after a week-long work trip was dirt. Not just a little dirt, my entire front yard was a flat patch of raw, uneven earth. My garden, the one I spent 3 years building up with native plants, pollinator beds, and a hand-built cedar trellis, was gone. Completely wiped out, I threw the truck into park and jumped out. My neighbor Greg, who usually kept to himself, was already walking over from across the street, shaking his head like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Wesley," he said, "I tried to stop her, I really did." She brought 2 landscapers with her, said she had HOA clearance. I blinked. "Who the hell is she?" "Glenda," he said. "Glenda Lancaster, HOA board president, said your garden violated uniformity codes. She ordered them to take it out Monday morning. I told her you had approval for all of it last year, but she said it was overgrown and unsightly." My blood boiled. I wasn't some absentee homeowner. I paid my dues, followed the rules, and had written approval from the board back when I installed the native beds. I even had the emails printed and filed in my home office. I stormed into the house, dropped my bags, and opened the file drawer. The folder was still there, HOA correspondence. I flipped through, found the signed approval with the date, and grabbed every photo I had printed of the garden's progress. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the state's Environmental Conservation Office. Glenda clearly hadn't done her homework. Our town had a native plant protection ordinance passed last year, and my garden was registered under it, removing a certified native garden without notice. That was a state-level fine, and it wasn't cheap. By dinner, I had filed the complaint. I even attached the before and after photos, the HOA approval, and a statement from Greg. The confirmation email said they'd investigate within 72 hours. The next morning, I saw Glenda walking her little yappy dog, Muffin, like nothing had happened. She paused when she noticed me outside, arms crossed, standing on the edge of my ruined lawn. "Oh," she said, fake cheerful. "Wesley, you're back. I was just about to leave you a notice. Your front yard was in severe violation, so we had to take swift action." "Violation?" I asked. "You mean the garden that was approved by the HOA last year?" Her smile faltered for half a second. "Well, the board recently updated the landscaping standards, and your yard no longer—" "You mean you updated the standards, without a vote?" She sniffed. "The board has discretion for emergency aesthetic corrections." That was the moment I knew she was bluffing. There was no such clause. I'd read the bylaws front to back. "You're going to want to check your mail tomorrow," I said. Glenda tilted her head. "Excuse me?" "State's involved now." "You destroyed a certified native habitat. That's a $5,000 fine, and that's just the beginning." Her face went white. Muffin barked once and tugged at the leash like even the dog could feel the tension. "You're bluffing," she said. "Nope," I said. "And I've got the paperwork to prove every word. Good luck explaining that to the rest of the board." By Thursday morning, the state envelope landed in Glenda's mailbox. I knew because I saw her standing at the curb, flipping through the thick packet with trembling fingers while Muffin did laps around her ankles. Her mouth moved silently as she read the first few lines. Then she stopped cold, turned on her heel, and marched back toward her house like someone had cut her marionette strings. I didn't stay to watch her unravel. I had a meeting at City Hall. The local environmental officer, Maria DuPont, had responded to my complaint faster than expected. She'd reviewed the documentation I submitted and flagged the case for escalation, citing willful destruction of protected flora. I met her in a second-floor office lined with framed wildlife photos and a plant native poster tacked above her desk. "Your records are impeccable," she said, flipping through the file I'd brought. "And this." She tapped one of the photographs showing my pre-approved trellis surrounded by bee balm and purple coneflower matches the registry images. She didn't just violate local code. She breached state conservation law. That's a Class 2 offense if proven intentional. She ordered landscapers, I said. Greg across the street witnessed the whole thing. She claimed HOA authority. Maria raised an eyebrow. Did she provide a permit? Or file a request with the Environmental Board before removal? Not a word. She nodded and picked up her phone. I'm referring this to the district attorney's compliance unit. If she acted under false authority and the HOA didn't formally approve the destruction, that's impersonation under color of law. And if she paid those landscapers herself. She did, I interrupted. Greg said her personal checkbook came out after they finished. Maria exhaled sharply. That makes it worse. She's personally liable for the environmental damages and possibly facing criminal misrepresentation. The next day, a plain sedan from the county's Environmental Enforcement Division pulled onto Glenda's driveway. 2 officers got out, one with a clipboard, the other with a camera. I didn't need to get close to hear her voice echoing off the cul-de-sac as she tried to argue with them. You can't just show up here like this. I'm the HOA president. That's not how this works, ma'am, the officer said, steady. You're not above state law. We have probable cause and a verified complaint. I walked to the edge of my property, arms folded, and watched silently as they took soil samples, measured the area, and took photographs of the wrecked garden bed. Glenda's protests became more erratic. You're going to regret this, she snapped at one of the officers. I have connections on the zoning board. The woman with the clipboard didn't flinch. Then I suggest you call them, because you may be facing formal charges. That night, the HOA group chat exploded. I didn't usually participate, but I lurked enough to see the board's internal panic spill into public view. The treasurer, Mark Ellison, asked why the HOA had been named in a state compliance letter he received that afternoon. Glenda tried to play it off as a misunderstanding with an overgrown yard, but the screenshots of the fine, over $10,000 in total, shut her down fast. Residents began piling on. Someone posted a side-by-side of my garden before and after, captioned, "This is what HOA beautification looks like." Another shared the state's native plant registry link, highlighting my address. Then came the kicker. An anonymous user dropped a PDF of the HOA's landscaping policy, annotated with highlights showing no recent changes had been filed or ratified. That meant Glenda's emergency aesthetic correction wasn't just unauthorized, it was a fantasy. The following morning, Mark knocked on my door. He looked genuinely embarrassed, holding a mug of coffee like a peace offering. I had no idea she did this, he said. There was no vote, no meeting. She never mentioned any of this to the board. She told Greg it was board approved, I said. She lied, he replied flatly. I checked the minutes. There's nothing on record. She acted alone. I stepped aside to let him in. So what happens now? We're calling an emergency meeting, he said, and we're inviting the residents this time. This isn't just about a garden. She's been pushing through all sorts of nonsense lately. Fines for mailbox paint, demands for matching patio furniture. None of it voted on. I sat down at the kitchen table and slid the folder of documents toward him. I've got everything here. Approval forms, photos, state certification. The works. He took it without hesitation. When this is over, we'll cover restoration costs. I want more than a refund, I said. I want her off the board, he nodded. So does everyone else. By Sunday, the neighborhood clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs stretched wall to wall, and even the back patio had residents clustered around with folded arms and narrowed eyes. Glenda stood at the front, flanked by 2 remaining board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her sweater draped over her shoulders like she was hosting a garden party, not facing a mutiny. I know emotions are high, she began, but let's remember the importance of maintaining community standards. A man in the back stood and cut her off. Save it. You destroyed private property, lied about board approval, and now the entire HOA is on the hook for a state fine. What standards are you even talking about? Murmurs turned to full-throated agreement. Someone near the front raised a printed copy of the fine and held it up like a court exhibit. Wesley's garden was certified, a woman said. You didn't just tear out flowers, you violated environmental law. Glenda's face twitched. That was a subjective determination. I believed it posed a risk of attracting vermin. You mean bees? Another voice snapped. Pollinators are protected, not pests. Mark stepped forward then, holding my folder. We've reviewed all the documents, he said. The garden had full approval. There was no vote to rescind that, no emergency declaration, no board consensus. Glenda acted alone. As such, the board is moving to remove her under Section 8, Article 5 of the bylaw's abuse of authority. Glenda's mouth opened, but no words came out. For once, she didn't have a speech ready. And, Mark continued, we've decided to pay for full restoration of Wesley's garden using discretionary funds. We'll also be reviewing all recent fines and enforcement actions for legitimacy. Applause broke out. Glenda stared ahead, blinking rapidly, her posture collapsing as the room turned against her. Someone near the back called out, maybe she can plant trees for community service. That got a laugh, then another. Even Muffin barked once like he'd caught the joke too. By the time the meeting ended, Glenda had left through the side door, trailed by whispers and camera phones. The next morning, a city truck pulled up to my curb. 2 staffers stepped out to begin measuring the lot for replanting. Maria herself followed, clipboard in hand. We're fast-tracking your restoration, she said. State's footing half the bill, HOA's covering the rest. And Glenda, Maria smiled faintly. The DA's reviewing the file, misuse of authority, destruction of protected habitat, and misrepresentation of legal powers. Might not be jail time, but definitely probation, fines, and a permanent record. I nodded slowly. She'll never run a board again. Not unless it's at bingo night. As the workers began outlining the new garden beds, I watched neighbors walk by, waving, smiling, a few even stopping to offer help. Turns out, the more Glenda tried to control everything, the more the neighborhood realized it was time to take control back. 2 weeks passed, and the garden restoration was already underway. City crews laid down topsoil, local volunteers helped replant native grasses and milkweed, and even the neighborhood kids pitched in to rebuild the trellis. It was the first time in years I'd seen people gathering outside without a clipboard wielding HOA patrol looming nearby. But while the yard began to return to life, something darker was growing beneath the surface. It started with a knock on my door just after sunset. A man in a gray jacket stood on the porch holding a leather folder and a badge. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. "That's me," I said, stepping out and closing the door behind me. "Detective Lyle Roston, County Property Crimes Division. Mind if I ask you a few questions about Glenda Lancaster?" I nodded slowly. "Sure." "What's this about?" He opened the folder and flipped to a page showing a photocopy of a check. "Have you ever seen this before?" I studied it. The name at the top was a landscaping company from 2 towns over. The signature was Glenda's. The memo line read, "Emergency Correction Bramble Ridge HOA." "That's the crew she hired," I said. "They cleared my yard." "Right," Roston said. "The company owner came forward last week. Turns out Glenda paid them using a check from the HOA's reserve account, not her personal funds. And there's more than one." I felt my jaw tighten. "She used HOA money. Almost $15,000 across 4 checks," he said. "We're investigating possible embezzlement, misappropriation of community funds, and falsification of board documents." "Did you ever see a vote authorizing her to use HOA money for discretionary landscaping?" "There wasn't one," I said. "She told a neighbor she had full authority, but there was no meeting." He closed the folder. "That lines up with the treasurer's report. We've already pulled the financials." She added the expense under a fake project code labeled grounds remediation, even forged a second signature. I shook my head, and no one noticed. Until recently, no, but the fines from the state triggered a deeper audit. That's when the missing funds came to light. "We're building a case, but we'll need a statement from you." I agreed. The next morning, I drove to the sheriff's office and gave a full deposition. I brought the emails, the photos, and the original garden approval. They scanned everything, thanked me, and assured me the case was moving fast. Glenda wasn't just in deep water, she was sinking. Later that week, I noticed Glenda's house had gone dark. Curtains drawn, porch lights off. Even the little flag she used to hang near her mailbox was gone. Muffin's barking had stopped too. Then, on a crisp Tuesday morning, a black SUV parked in front of her driveway. Two plainclothes officers stepped out. One walked up the front path while the other waited near the mailbox. A moment later, Glenda opened the door. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching as she tried to close it again. The officer caught it with his boot and handed her a folded document. It took less than 5 minutes. She didn't resist, but she didn't speak either. Her expression was hollow, like someone who'd finally realized the rules applied to her too. They walked her to the SUV without handcuffs, but the neighborhood was already buzzing. Phones were out. Conversations rippled down the block. By afternoon, the news was on the local station. Former HOA president arrested in community funds investigation, the anchor read. Charges include embezzlement, falsifying public records, and destruction of protected habitat. But that wasn't the end. At the emergency board meeting the following Saturday, Mark stood before a packed room, holding a newly revised set of governing documents. "We've consulted with legal counsel," he began. "And we've taken steps to prevent anything like this from happening again." He handed out packets to every resident. The new bylaws included mandatory transparency measures. All board decisions now required recorded votes, resident review periods, and third-party audits every fiscal quarter. No more decisions behind closed doors. No more power plays. And Glenda, she was permanently barred from holding any leadership position in any registered HOA in the state. The Department of Community Management had added her to a disqualification registry, citing ethical violations and fiduciary misconduct. But even that didn't satisfy everyone. One neighbor, Mr. Harlan, stood up and cleared his throat. "I think we should consider pressing civil charges as well." She didn't just steal money, she turned this place into a dictatorship. Several heads nodded. A woman near the back added, "She fined me $300 for having a green garden hose." Green said it disrupted the neutral palette. I still have the letter. Mark raised his hands. "We're working with an attorney to explore restitution. If you've received a fine in the last 6 months, bring it to the next meeting. We'll review every single one." It was slow work, but it meant something. By the time spring came around, my yard was blooming again. The trellis was covered in clematis. Bees buzzed between the salvia and goldenrod, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe on my own property. One afternoon, I was planting a row of asters when Greg walked over with a paper cup of lemonade. "Place looks better than ever," he said, handing it to me. "You know, we're thinking of starting a neighborhood garden club, not official, just folks who actually like plants." "I'm in," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Good," he said. "And between you and me, we're thinking of naming it after your garden." I laughed. "Wesley's Wildscape," he grinned. "Better than Glenda's gravel patch." That night, as I sat on the porch watching the wind rustle through the tall grass, I thought about the way one person's ego had nearly ruined a neighborhood. But I also thought about how quickly people stood up when the truth came out. No one wanted to live under a tyrant in a cardigan. The HOA still existed, but it was different now. It was accountable, transparent, human, and Glenda, last I heard, she'd moved in with her sister across the county line. Her name still came up from time to time, usually when someone found an old fine tucked in a drawer or remembered the time she threatened to ban solar panels for being visually aggressive. But mostly, she faded from memory. Just another overreacher who thought the rules were hers to write. Now the rules belonged to the people. And the garden, it was more than a patch of flowers. It was proof that no matter how deep someone digs their control, truth grows back stronger. By early April, the garden had fully taken root again. The city's environmental department kept their promise and helped replant every square foot, including a few new additions. I hadn't even considered before, like a corner of California poppies and a small solar-powered water feature for pollinators. The trellis was rebuilt stronger, this time anchored with steel brackets and a community plaque mounted at the base. It read, "Restored by neighbors, protected by law." But there was still one piece left hanging. The HOA's insurance had paid out restitution, and Glenda was removed permanently, but that didn't erase what she'd done. While the board had turned over a new leaf and residents were more involved than ever, something still didn't sit right. Not with me, not with Greg, and not with the other homeowners who'd found themselves caught in her whirlwind of control. Then one morning, I got an email from a name I didn't recognize, Darla Henley, a quiet woman who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac. She asked if I had a moment to talk. Within an hour, she was sitting at my patio table, hands folded tightly, a blue folder resting on her lap. "I didn't know who else to talk to," she said. "You've handled all of this better than anyone, and I think there's something more you need to see." She slid the folder across the table. Inside were copies of letters, not from the HOA but from a private contractor. Fence repairs, driveway pressure washing, gutter replacements, all billed to the HOA, all signed off by Glenda. But the kicker: they were all for her own property. "She had the board pay for this?" I asked. Darla nodded. "She told me it was part of a beautification grant for testing improvements before rolling them out to the rest of us." I believed her at the time. But none of it ever happened beyond her house. I flipped through the invoices. They were all marked paid, and the checks were drawn from the HOA's reserve fund, the same fund that had covered my garden's demolition. None of this had been mentioned in the audit the board conducted, likely because Glenda had buried these transactions under unrelated budget lines. I called Mark and asked him to meet us. He arrived within 20 minutes, still in his work clothes, and when he saw the folder, his face stiffened. "I thought we'd caught everything," he muttered, flipping pages. "She had me sign off on a few of these. She said they were for sidewalk repairs on common grounds." "She lied," Darla said quietly. "She threatened to fine me if I talked about it. Said I was spreading rumors." Mark set down the folder. "We're reopening the books, and I'm calling the DA." That night, I found myself back at the sheriff's office. This time, I wasn't giving a statement, I was reviewing evidence. The detective, Roston, had been deep into Glenda's financial trail since her arrest, and the folder Darla brought in was the final piece. She used her position to funnel over $30,000 in personal improvements, Roston said, pointing to a spreadsheet of transactions. "Filed under maintenance projects that never existed. We're preparing additional charges: fraudulent use of community funds, financial coercion, and abuse of fiduciary authority." "What's the penalty for that?" I asked. "Could be 5 years, he said. "Minimum. More if the judge sees a pattern of coercion. And based on some of the witness statements, there's definitely a pattern." As word spread, more residents came forward. One man had been charged a compliance fee when he refused to replace his perfectly functional wooden fence. Another woman had been told her driveway was illegally wide and was forced to pay for a contractor Glenda personally selected. All of it traced back to the same shell company's businesses linked to a cousin of Glenda's. Every time someone tried to fight back, they'd been threatened with escalating fines or even liens. Most had paid just to avoid the drama. The DA's office issued a formal notice to all residents encouraging anyone who'd been financially impacted to submit a sworn complaint. Within 3 days, over 20 people had come forward. Glenda's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal: probation, a fine, maybe restitution. But the DA refused. Too many victims, too much damage. The trial was scheduled for mid-May. It wasn't a media circus, but it drew a crowd. Dozens of residents filled the courtroom, some standing in the back. Glenda sat at the defendant's table, her once pristine composure replaced by a hollow stare. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her lies had finally caught up. The prosecution laid out the paper trail with brutal clarity: falsified invoices, misappropriated funds, coercive threats, and the destruction of state-protected property. Witnesses testified one after another, including Darla, Greg, and even Mark. Each told a slightly different story, but the pattern was unmistakable. When it was my turn, I brought the original approval letter, the garden photos, and the state's restoration report. I didn't need to embellish anything. The facts spoke for themselves. When the verdict came down, it was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hold back. "This case represents a grotesque abuse of community trust," he said. "You used your position not to serve but to exploit. You targeted your neighbors, manipulated records, and destroyed property under the guise of authority." He sentenced her to 4 years in a low-security correctional facility, with mandatory restitution to be paid to every resident she defrauded. Her assets, including her home, were seized to begin the repayment process. When she was let out, she didn't look at anyone. Not even Muffin, who'd been rehomed by her sister months earlier. Back in the neighborhood, something changed. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet confidence of people who'd learned to stand up. The HOA was no longer a threat, it was a tool, and it was in the hands of people who respected their neighbors. The new board held monthly open meetings, published all financials on a shared drive, and even created an anonymous feedback form for concerns. Rules were rewritten with resident input, and the ridiculous fines of the past were tossed out completely, and me. I joined the board not out of ambition, but because I wanted to make sure no one like Glenda ever slipped through again. One evening, as I was planting a row of scarlet sage under the new trellis, Greg walked by with a small cardboard box. "Picked these up at the nursery," he said. "Thought they'd go well with what you've got." Inside were 3 pots of blue-eyed grass, a native that I'd once mentioned wanting to add. I looked up at him, surprised. "We're not just neighbors anymore," he said. "We're a community." "You started that." I took the plants, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace that came from knowing justice had been done, and that we'd earned back our neighborhood the right way. No more fake authority, no more hidden agendas, just people growing something real.